Have you ever wondered what happens when an untouchable billionaire pushes a seemingly helpless woman just 1 inch too far? What if the person you thought you completely owned was actually the one holding the keys to your destruction? Preston Whitfield had always believed that money could buy absolutely anything. Reputation, power, silence, even the souls of people. For 20 long years, he lived like an absolute king inside his $30 million modern luxury mansion overlooking the rolling hills of Virginia. Politicians eagerly shook his hand at charity galas. Television hosts constantly praised his generosity on national networks. Mainstream business magazines frequently called him the perfect embodiment of the American dream. But behind those towering iron gates, underneath the shadow of the perfectly manicured white columns, existed a completely different world. It was a world where employees were never called by their actual names, but by their titles. A world where fear was the only real currency traded between the hallways. And a world where a wealthy man found his deepest pleasure in making vulnerable people feel completely worthless. Of all the people who had ever worked inside that colossal house, none had ever lasted more than a year. None. The high turnover rate was treated by the outside world as a quirky trait of an eccentric billionaire, but the truth inside the walls was a living nightmare. Until Laurie arrived. She was a middle-aged black woman with her hair tied neatly into a tight, professional bun. She wore simple reading glasses hanging from a thin silver chain around her neck and a plain, unbranded gray uniform that had seen better days. She spoke very little, kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, and answered almost every single question with the same 2 words, "Yes, sir." To Preston Whitfield, she was just another piece of disposable property. Just another maid he could humiliate, control, break, and eventually forget when she finally packed her bags and left in tears. What his immense arrogance blinded him from knowing was that every single insult was being meticulously recorded. Every desperate threat was becoming legal evidence. And every single cruel act was adding another invisible brick to the prison cell that would one day belong to him. 11 months, 330 days, nearly 8,000 hours of human endurance. Laurie Calloway had arrived at the Whitfield estate carrying nothing but a single, generic suitcase. Nothing about her appearance stood out, and that was entirely intentional. She wore cheap reading glasses, scuffed black shoes, and no jewelry whatsoever, except for a tiny gold earring in her left ear that she never removed. When she first stepped through the iron servant's entrance, nobody paid any attention to her. She was just another face trying to survive the crushing economy. The estate itself looked like something torn straight from a luxury architectural magazine. Imported white marble floors gleamed under massive crystal chandeliers, and perfect French gardens stretched for acres. A place meticulously built to impress the outside elite. But beautiful things almost always hide the ugliest secrets. Laurie noticed the dark reality on her very first afternoon. The silence inside the mansion wasn't peaceful. It was the fearful, heavy kind of silence that settles over people who spend every second of their lives waiting for something bad to explode. The head cook barely spoke above a whisper. The veteran gardener never made eye contact with anyone, and the housekeepers moved through the long, echoing halls like silent ghosts. Then Preston Whitfield walked into the dining room, and the temperature changed instantly. Conversations vanished, shoulders stiffened, and eyes dropped to the floor. Nobody needed to be told who held the power. Preston stopped, pointed his finger at a microscopic water spot on a crystal drinking glass, looked directly at Laurie, and said, "If I ever see that again, you're gone." There was no greeting, no introduction, and no human welcome, just a cold threat. Then he looked around at the rest of the trembling staff and muttered, "Kitchen, laundry, garden, driver. I don't learn names. Names are for people who actually matter." The room remained dead silent for several seconds after his heavy footsteps faded, as if everyone was waiting to make sure the monster was truly gone. Finally, the cook exhaled a long, exhausted breath, leaned over to Laurie and whispered, "Get used to it, honey. Just keep your head down and survive." That night, Laurie sat alone inside her tiny staff room located in the furthest corner of the servants' wing. The room was barely larger than a standard walk-in closet, containing one narrow twin bed, one small wooden desk, and one tiny window overlooking the dark back lawn. Most people in her position would have cried or packed their bags to quit by midnight. But Laurie simply sat in the darkness, thinking, watching, and listening to the distant hum of the mansion's security grid. She had already seen enough in those first 12 hours to know that the whispers on the outside were true, and the reality inside was far worse than anyone outside that mansion could possibly realize. As the weeks turned into months, the calculated cruelty never stopped. One afternoon, Preston accused a young, 20-year-old housekeeper of stealing a diamond bracelet from his wife's vanity. He ordered the entire staff to line up against the grand dining room wall like common criminals. One by one, under his watchful, mocking eyes, they were forced to empty their pockets, open their lockers, and endure a public humiliation that stripped them of their dignity. The expensive bracelet was eventually found exactly where Preston's wife had carelessly misplaced it, deep under a silk sofa cushion in the main lounge. Nobody apologized to the staff. Preston didn't even look at them when the security guard handed the bracelet back. The employees simply returned to their sweeping and cleaning, as if being treated like criminals was a completely normal condition of employment. Another time, during a humid summer week when the air conditioning in the kitchen broke down, Preston forced the entire staff to eat their lunch on the cold, hard tile floor of the active laundry room. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, watching them sweat as the detergent fumes burned their noses, and said with a dark smile, "See? Now that's exactly where you people belong." By the 7th month of her employment, Laurie had learned an invaluable piece of intelligence. What Preston Whitfield did to people wasn't just random, uncontrolled anger. It was a highly organized system. It was a routine, a carefully constructed psychological machine designed to make human beings feel incredibly small so that he could feel unimaginably large. And the deeper Laurie looked into the corners of the estate, the darker that machine became. It started with a locked, narrow steel door at the far end of the basement corridor, hidden directly behind the massive water heaters and electrical breaker panels. Most employees didn't even know the door existed, and those who did knew better than to ever ask questions. But Preston checked that door personally every single week without fail. He would walk downstairs alone, unlock the heavy steel, disappear inside, and emerge several minutes later looking strangely satisfied, as though he had just visited an old, wealthy friend or admired a rare, favorite possession. That specific feeling stayed with Laurie for weeks until finally, her tactical curiosity won. Late one evening, when the mansion had fallen into a deep sleep, Laurie returned to that basement corridor. With a soft, metallic click of her specialized lockpicking tools, the deadbolt turned. The heavy steel door slid open silently. Inside was a small, windowless concrete room containing nothing but rows of fireproof filing cabinets. When Laurie pulled open the first drawer, the entire scope of the operation changed. Her eyes moved across hundreds of neatly organized, alphabetized folders containing names, dates, photographs, legal non-disclosure agreements, and confidential settlement contracts. Page after page, year after year, a terrifying, systematic pattern unfolded before her. One folder detailed a young woman who reported being slapped across the face during a private dinner party. Another file contained a gardener's detailed description of severe racial abuse and threats of deportation. A third folder documented a housekeeper who had been locked inside a dark pantry for 12 hours as punishment for a broken vase. Every single story ended exactly the same way: a massive payout of money, forced silence, permanent confidentiality clauses, and the total disappearance of the victim from the county records. Preston didn't keep these files because he needed them for legal protection. He kept them as trophies. He kept them because every folder represented a victory, a permanent reminder of another human voice he had successfully silenced with his wealth. Laurie stood frozen as a terrible realization settled over her. The people in these folders weren't numbers. They were real human beings with families, dreams, and lives that had been completely derailed by one man's unchecked ego. Then, deep in the bottom drawer, she found a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of a young black woman in her mid-20s, with a bright, beautiful smile and a jagged, white scar running across her right wrist. Attached to the photograph was a $95,000 settlement agreement and a handwritten note in Preston's elegant cursive writing that read, "Know your place." Laurie carefully returned the folder to its exact position, closing the cabinet drawer without making a single sound. Her hands remained completely steady, but her internal focus had shifted entirely. The investigation was no longer just about an abusive billionaire employer. It was about exposing an entire corrupt social system that allowed men like Preston Whitfield to operate above the law because they could afford to buy everyone's silence. 3 days after her discovery in the basement, the first real sign of danger arrived. It came in the form of a simple, sudden question during dinner. Preston looked up from his steak, his eyes narrowing into slits, and asked Laurie, "How long did you say you've been working in domestic service before you came to my house?" Laurie kept her face a perfect, unreadable mask, answering smoothly, "About 15 years, sir." Preston stared at her for an uncomfortably long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. He finally nodded and returned to his meal, but the invisible line had been crossed. The very next morning, Laurie returned to her staff room and noticed it had been professionally searched. The changes were tiny, the kind of micro details only a trained operative would ever notice. The mattress had been lifted and put back slightly crooked, her dresser drawer sat half an inch out of alignment, and a framed photograph on her nightstand had been turned slightly to the left. Someone was looking for something, and they had found absolutely nothing. Within the following week, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted dramatically. 4 new high-definition security cameras appeared in the staff corridors. Personal cell phone use was completely banned during shifts, and all incoming mail for the servants was ordered to be routed through Preston's private security office first. The multi-million-dollar mansion had officially transformed into a maximum security prison. Ruth, the head cook, approached Laurie near the pantry one afternoon while chopping vegetables, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "He's asking deep questions about you, Laurie," Ruth whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen door. "He's asking questions about your schedule. He wants to know exactly where you go on your days off, who you talk to on the phone, and why you never look afraid when he screams. Everyone in this house is terrified of him, Laurie, but you look like you're just waiting. You need to be careful. He's ruined people for far less." Laurie offered a calm, reassuring smile, continuing to peel her potatoes, and replied softly, "You'd be surprised what a person can survive when they know exactly what they're fighting for." That same night, Preston lines everyone against the wall for his next psychological move. After the dinner service had concluded, his voice boomed over the house intercom system, ordering the entire staff to report to the grand dining room immediately. Nobody asked why, they simply obeyed. The 6 employees lined up against the expensive wood paneling, their breath shallow, their hands shaking. Preston paced slowly across the marble floor, his highly polished leather shoes clicking with an ominous, rhythmic sound. He held a folded sheet of paper in his right hand, his expression completely unreadable. Finally, he stopped directly in front of Laurie, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Someone in this house is lying to me," he whispered, a dangerous smile appearing on his lips. "What is your actual full name? And where exactly were you employed before you brought your suitcase to my gate?" Laurie looked him dead in the eye, answering calmly, confidently, using the flawless, deep-cover background identity that federal analysts had spent months building for her. She listed the fake agencies, the fake addresses, and the real phone numbers that would route directly to a secure federal desk downtown. Preston listened to every syllable, his smile twisting into something sharper. He unfolded the paper in his hand. "You know, I had my private security team run a check on those names. Why is it that nobody in the city seems to actually remember your face, Laurie?" Laurie shrugged her shoulders lightly, maintaining perfect composure, and replied, "I suppose I'm just a very forgettable person, sir. People in my position usually are." A few nervous, involuntary chuckles escaped from the housekeepers at the end of the line, breaking the suffocating tension for a brief second. Preston didn't laugh. He kept his eyes locked onto hers, hunting for a single crack in her psychological armor, a single tremor in her voice. He found nothing. He finally stepped back, dismissing the staff with a wave of his hand, but Laurie knew the clock was now ticking faster than ever. 3 days later, the first major crack in Preston's empire appeared, but it didn't come from inside the house. It came from the internet. A 12-second video clip surfaced on a popular social media platform. It was shaky, low-quality cell phone footage recorded from a passing car near the front gates of the Whitfield estate. The audio was terrible, but there was no mistaking the visual. It showed a furious Preston Whitfield standing in his driveway, screaming at a delivery driver, his face twisted with rage, using severe profanity before throwing a package straight at the man's head. The video went viral instantly, exploding from thousands of views to tens of millions within hours. The public narrative around the beloved billionaire began to fracture. Mainstream television networks picked up the story, independent journalists started digging into his corporate past, and former employees began receiving anonymous interview requests from investigative reporters. The Whitfield mansion entered full panic mode. High-priced public relations firms worked 24 hours a day, lawyers drafted aggressive cease and desist letters, and Preston became increasingly unstable. He stopped sleeping entirely, began drinking his premium bourbon before noon, and smashed an expensive crystal vase against the grand fireplace simply because his lunch was served 5 minutes later than the schedule demanded. The entire staff moved through the house in absolute silence, cleaning up the broken glass while holding their breath, terrified of becoming the next target of his volatile rage. Then, unexpectedly, Gerald Whitfield arrived at the estate. Gerald was Preston's 34-year-old son, a well-dressed, highly successful corporate executive who had spent the last decade avoiding his father whenever humanly possible, using business trips and international vacations as permanent excuses to stay away from the Virginia mansion. But now, with the family empire shaking, he was back. From the moment he stepped through the front doors, Laurie noticed something fascinating about Gerald. He didn't watch the staff, he watched his father. At the dinner table, in the grand hallways, and during emergency corporate phone calls, Gerald watched Preston the exact way an expert bomb technician watches a highly unstable, ticking explosive device. One evening, while Laurie was dusting the antique shelves outside the private library, she heard the heavy mahogany door swing slightly open. Inside, Preston was pacing, his voice loud and ragged from alcohol and paranoia. "You have absolutely no idea what's happening out there, Gerald," Preston snapped, his glass ice clinking loudly. "They are actively trying to destroy me. The media, the competitors, the faceless cowards online. They want to tear down everything I spent 20 years building." Gerald's voice remained quiet, steady, and devastatingly calm. "No, Dad. You're wrong. They aren't trying to destroy you. They are finally exposing you." The library went completely, deathly silent. For a terrifying second, Laurie thought Preston might physically strike his own son. Instead, a massive crash echoed through the room as Preston threw a heavy bronze statue against the wall. When the library door finally opened, Gerald stepped out into the hallway, his face looking utterly drained, carrying a weight of generational guilt that had been growing inside him since childhood. He stopped when he noticed Laurie standing nearby with her dusting cloth. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Gerald looked into her eyes and whispered 2 words, "I'm sorry." Laurie blinked, maintaining her role. "What for, sir?" Gerald looked back toward the library door, toward the sound of his father's distant, angry shouting, and said, "For all of it." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Laurie alone in the quiet hallway. Later that evening, long after the mansion had gone completely dark, Laurie sat on the edge of her small bed. The rain was tapping softly against her window pane, casting long, moving shadows across the walls. Beside her nightstand, a small, encrypted burner phone vibrated once. She answered it on the first second. "Yes," she whispered. The voice on the other end was clear, professional, and definitive. "We have completed the server mirrors, Laurie. We have the basement files, the financial records, and the full history of the non-disclosure agreements. We have more than enough to secure a federal indictment. We can move the tactical units in tomorrow morning." Laurie closed her eyes, listening to the rain, calculating the chessboard. "Not yet," she responded quietly. "We have the paperwork, but men like Preston Whitfield always reveal their true nature right before they fall. Their immense ego won't let them hide, and their arrogance won't let them surrender quietly. When the pressure becomes completely unbearable, he will make a massive, public mistake. The kind of mistake that no high-priced lawyer can explain away and no jury can ignore. Give me 24 more hours." The federal supervisor on the other end sighed deeply, knowing the extreme risk she was taking. Be careful, Laurie. He's cornered, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. The line went dead. The next morning began like any other morning on the surface. Bright Virginia sunlight poured through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand entrance hall, making the white marble floors gleam like ice. Freshly cut flowers had been placed in the foyer, and the staff moved quickly through the corridors, trying their best to remain invisible. Laurie carried a silver breakfast tray through the grand hall, her movements measured, calm, and completely unhurried. But beneath her plain gray uniform, her pulse was sharp. She knew this was the final day. Across the grand foyer, Preston Whitfield stood near the massive window, his phone clenched so tightly in his right fist his knuckles were white. He had spent the entire dawn reading the morning papers. More leaked documents, more public accusations, more federal agencies launching preliminary inquiries into his business empire. His public reputation was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and for the first time in his 20-year career, his money couldn't buy a tourniquet. Then it happened. A tiny, microscopic accident. The edge of Laurie's silver breakfast tray clipped the sharp corner of an antique display table. A porcelain coffee cup tilted slightly to the side, and a few dark brown drops of hot coffee splashed across the immaculate, expensive white linen tablecloth. In any normal home, it would be a minor inconvenience forgotten in 5 minutes. But not in this house. Not on this day. Preston looked up from his phone, his eyes catching the spread of the brown stain on the linen. Something inside his mind finally, permanently snapped. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto a velvet chair. He turned and began walking slowly toward Laurie, his boots echoing across the marble like a death march. Every single employee in the foyer immediately froze in their tracks, their hearts dropping into their stomachs. They recognized that specific look in his eyes, the wild, dangerous look of a predator that had completely lost his mind. Laurie immediately reached for a clean white cloth, her voice remaining perfectly calm, respectful, and controlled. I'll clean it up immediately, sir. It was an accident. Preston stopped less than 12 inches from her face, the smell of premium bourbon and cold sweat radiating from his skin. His face twisted into a terrifying grin, the civilized billionaire completely vanishing, leaving only the monster underneath. 11 months, he growled, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that echoed off the high ceiling. 11 months I have tolerated your pathetic face in my house. I gave you a job. I gave you a roof over your head. I fed you my food, paid you my money, and somehow you are still completely incapable of doing one simple thing right. It was an accident, sir, Laurie repeated, her eyes remaining steady. Everything about your kind is an accident. Preston spat, his voice rising in fury. The room went completely silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Then Preston pointed his finger violently at the marble floor. Kneel. Nobody breathed. The housekeepers in the back corner covered their mouths. Inside this mansion, that word wasn't a request, it was a supreme command. And for 20 years, everyone had obeyed it. Always. But this time, Laurie Calloway didn't move. Slowly, with absolute precision, she raised her head for the first time in nearly a year. She looked directly into his wild eyes, not as an employee, not as a servant, and not as a victim. She looked at him as an absolute equal. And she spoke a single, clear word. No. The word struck Preston Whitfield like a physical slap across the face. For a long, stunned moment, he simply stared at her, his mind physically struggling to process the auditory data he had just received. Nobody said no to him. Not his executive boards, not his politicians, not his family, and certainly not a maid in a gray uniform. Say that again. His voice dropped into a dangerous, lethal whisper. Laurie didn't blink an eye. I said no. Preston's face twisted with pure, uncontrollable rage. He lunged forward with explosive speed, his massive hand wrapping brutally around Laurie's hair bun, twisting his fist tightly into the fabric of her hair and jerking her head backward with violent force. Pain shot through her neck, but she kept her eyes locked onto his. Preston began to drag her down toward the marble floor, shouting to the terrified staff, "Look at this! Look at this! This is exactly what happens when people forget their place in my world." But before his hand could pull her any further, Laurie's right hand clamped over his wrist with a tight, iron-like grip that shocked him. Her defensive tactics training engaged instantly, locking his joint in place. She didn't scream, she didn't cry out, and she didn't beg for his mercy. Instead, she looked into his panicked eyes, smiled a calm, certain smile, and spoke the single word she had been waiting 11 months to say. Federal. For one split second, the entire universe stood still. Then, the massive front doors of the multi-million-dollar mansion exploded inward with a deafening crash. Heavy oak wood splintered into pieces, reinforced glass shattered across the foyer, and the air was instantly filled with the thundering sound of tactical combat boots, flashbangs, and sharp, authoritative commands echoing off the marble. Federal agents. Everyone stay where you are. Hands on your heads. Drop to the floor. Let her go. Preston Whitfield froze instantly, his hands slipping from her hair as his arms were violently pinned behind his back by 3 heavily armed federal tactical officers. He was slammed face first onto his own expensive marble floor, right next to the spilled coffee stain. His eyes widened in absolute, naked terror as the steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The grand nightmare he had spent 20 years creating for other people had finally, permanently become his own. The federal trial lasted for 4 agonizing weeks. It became the biggest news story in the country, dominating every television network and newspaper headline. For weeks of devastating testimony, for weeks of irrefutable digital evidence, and 4 weeks of watching a man who once believed his wealth made him a god sit quietly, stripped of his power, behind a mahogany defense table while his dark secrets were laid bare for the entire world to see. One by one, the former employees of the Whitfield estate took the witness stand. Their voices trembled, some struggled to hold back tears, but their posture was completely different. They were no longer afraid. They had spent years believing that their stories would die in the dark, but now, the entire world was forced to listen. Among them was a young woman named Tanya Brooks, the same woman Laurie had found in the basement filing cabinet. Tanya walked into the packed courtroom, carrying nothing but the immense courage she had spent years trying to find. When she turned toward the jury, raised her right sleeve, and showed the white, jagged scar that Preston Whitfield had left on her wrist, the entire courtroom went dead silent. "This scar used to remind me of the night I was completely broken," Tanya said, her voice echoing off the high wood paneling. "But today, standing in this room, it reminds me of one thing. I survived, and he didn't." Not a single juror looked away. Because scars tell the ultimate stories, and sometimes, simply choosing to survive is the bravest story a human being can ever write. When the federal jury finally returned with the verdict, there were no dramatic Hollywood speeches, no loud shouting, and no grand celebrations. There was only a profound, quiet moment of absolute justice as the jury foreperson stood up in the silent room and read the decision. Guilty on count 1. Guilty on count 2. Guilty on count 3. The man who had spent decades using his wealth to make other human beings feel completely powerless finally experienced exactly what true powerlessness felt like. As the federal marshals led Preston Whitfield away in heavy chains, he stopped at the swinging wooden gate, turning back to look at the gallery one final time. He didn't look at the judge, he didn't look at the flashing cameras of the media, and he didn't look at his high-priced defense lawyers. He looked directly at Laurie Calloway. The woman he had called a cockroach, the woman he had ordered to kneel on his floor, was standing perfectly tall in the center of the room, her shoulders back, her eyes calm and victorious. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, and she was holding the keys to the kingdom. Weeks later, after the media storm had finally settled, investigative reporters caught up with Laurie outside the federal building, asking her what had been the most difficult, painful part of the entire 11-month deep cover operation inside that house. The journalists expected her to talk about the constant insults, the terrifying threats, or the physical abuse she had endured. But Laurie slowly shook her head, looked at the microphones, and said, "The hardest part of the entire operation wasn't what Preston Whitfield did to me. The hardest part was standing in that house every single day, watching good, honest people look at themselves in the mirror and genuinely believe they deserve to be treated that way." Those words spread like wildfire across the country, leaving a permanent mark on the public consciousness. Because the story of the Whitfield estate was never really about a billionaire, it was never about a $30 million mansion, and it was never about the currency of money or power. It was about something much larger, something deeply human. It was a stark, powerful reminder of the extreme danger of staying completely silent when we witness an injustice occurring right in front of our eyes. It was a reminder of the danger of believing that powerful people cannot be challenged, and the eternal, unyielding truth that every single human being on this earth deserves absolute dignity, no matter what their job is, no matter what their income says, and no matter where they come from. The reality of life is that most people will never have to face a monster like Preston Whitfield inside a grand mansion. But every single one of us, at some point in our lives, will eventually face a quiet moment where we must make a definitive choice. Do we choose to stay completely silent because it is safe? Or do we find the courage to speak up? Do we choose to turn our heads and walk away because it is comfortable? Or do we choose to stand firmly beside someone who desperately needs our help? History rarely changes because of the loudest, most aggressive person in the room. More often than not, history changes because one quiet, ordinary person finally decides that they are no longer afraid to say no. And that is exactly what happened here. One woman refused to kneel on a marble floor. One woman refused to let fear dictate her silence. And in doing so, she broke the invisible chains of an entire household, giving dozens of ordinary voices the ultimate courage to finally stand up, speak out, and find their own power too. Now that you have witnessed the full breakdown of Preston Whitfield's empire, I want you to look closely at your own surroundings and answer this in the comments section. What would you have done if you were standing in that grand foyer on that chaotic morning? If you saw an incredibly powerful man losing control, demanding absolute submission from someone who couldn't fight back, would you have found the strength to step forward and speak up, or would the suffocating weight of fear have kept you completely frozen in the shadows? Let's start a real, raw conversation in the comments below because your perspective matters more than you think. And if this journey moved your heart, if it reminded you that no amount of wealth or social status gives anyone the right to strip another human being of their fundamental respect, please take one short second to hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel right now. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep cinematic investigation, and share this story with someone in your life who needs a powerful reminder of their own worth today. Remember, your silence is never just silence. It is always an active choice. Thank you for watching, stay strong, and I will see you in the next story.